Mucha gente utiliza las palabras liberal y liberalismo en estos tiempos sin tener una idea clara de lo que esto significa. Utiliza, de hecho, las palabras para referirse a un sistema político en que se violan las libertades individuales o se restringen las libertades económicas, exactamente lo contrario de esta palabra. Pero hay un libro que se ha publicado en español que se llama La historia olvidada del liberalismo. Es de la profesora Helena Rosenblatt, profesora de historia en el Centro de Estudios de Posgrado de la Universidad de la Ciudad de Nueva York. Vamos a conversar con la profesora Rosenblatt, lo vamos a hacer en inglés y vamos a colocar subtítulos para que usted pueda escucharla o pueda leer los subtítulos en español. Professor Rosenblatt, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Professor, tell us, a lot of people are using the word liberalism or the word liberal, but sometimes with exactly the opposite meaning that I would assume the word has. It doesn't mean a defense of liberty, a defense of individual freedoms. It actually is a defense of a system, a political system, where economic freedoms or other freedoms would be restricted by the government. Why is it that we're having this, and what is the actual meaning of liberal or liberalism?
Well, thank you for that question. It's really what drove me to write this book, to start writing this book, because I noticed that the word was being used so differently. I mean, take, for example, in America, where in colloquial parlance, most people, when they use the word, they mean big government. They mean government regulate, or an openness to government regulation, the openness to a welfare state. Whereas in Europe and in the rest of the world, it tends to mean the opposite: free markets, small government. And yet, people talk about this thing of coming from an Anglo-American tradition, that they have the same ancestors. They speak about John Locke, for example, or Adam Smith, or so on and so forth. And I wanted to see, how did this come about? And so what I do in my book is I explain what this word liberal has meant, going back to ancient Rome and through history, centuries of history until today, and show how these meanings, how liberalism at a certain point was coined, a cluster of ideas, and then how this was transformed over time, and how these two streams really developed, where one stream believed very much in free markets and small government, and the other stream of liberalism went more for government regulation and a welfare state.
So you actually take us back to the Roman times, but was there a market at that time? Did the word liberal or liberalism mean anything in Roman times?
Well, the word liberalism was really coined and the concept theorized only as an outcome of the French Revolution. And interestingly enough, it seems that the first uses of the word were in Spain. Of course, no, in Roman times, there was no such thing as liberalism. The word didn't exist. Being liberal in ancient Rome meant exhibiting the qualities of a citizen, the noble qualities of the citizen, being generous, being freedom-loving. Over time, it began to take on these other meanings and became politicized. But it really became a political movement only after the French Revolution, and as a consequence of the French Revolution. That's when you begin to have a liberal party. And the first liberal party was in Spain again. In 1810, Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808. The Cortes in Cadiz was formed in 1812. And that's really also when the word liberalism and the cluster of ideas to which it referred happened. A very important role for Spain, actually, but I explained the influence of French Revolution and Spain and how it gets then re-articulated also in Germany. The idea that this is an Anglo-American tradition is really a myth that we have because of the Cold War.
Was in the 19th century in Spain and in other countries, did it mean the defense of market freedoms, or the meaning was different?
Well, liberalism has always been debated among liberals. It has not been a static, unified ideology, if you will. Liberals have always argued amongst themselves. But yes, free markets was valued. Basically, what liberalism stood for early 19th century, when the concept was first conceptualized, invented, stood for a cluster of concepts: free rule of law, civic equality, constitutional representative government, and a number of individual rights. But freedom of religion, I would say, was the most important, freedom of speech, and then, of course, the right to private property. And at the time, because there were still feudal laws in place, freedom of trade, bringing down barriers in the hope that this would liberate and grow the economy. But I would say that free markets were not the first of the things that the liberals fought for. It was among several individual rights and freedoms.
In the United States today, liberal and liberalism means actually a progressive or a leftist, and it actually is it's an idea that actually promotes a greater intervention of the government in people's lives and people's economic activities. How did this happen? How did this idea of liberalism in the States moved about in such a way that it diverged, that is so divergent from what we see in Europe today?
Well, what happened was in the middle of the 19th century and towards the end, as liberals began to see the transformations in the economy and new problems caused by industrialization and urbanization, first in England, but they sensed that it was coming to France and Germany as well. They saw the problems being created, particularly in the cities, the growth of a class of poor working people who seemed not to be able to pull themselves out of poverty. A new word was used, Popperism, kind of, people who are basically stuck. And at that point, in England and in France and in Germany, liberals began to be interested in this group of thinkers, these German thinkers who were speaking about government intervention and how it was a moral duty of the government to step in to cure these problems, to do something about it. They felt that, looking at England, free markets or freedom, they needed things like laws to limit factory work for children, for women, for men. You needed other insurance issues, such things. They thought that the government should intervene. Other people, other liberals, however, said, no, that's not the way to go. What we need is even freer markets. That's what's going to raise the level of the worker and disseminate more wealth. So it was really an argument among liberals, which was the best way to go. And it created this thing called New Liberalism, which was these liberals more inclined to government intervention. It was that liberalism that came to America in early 20th century, and that's really when Americans started to talk about liberalism in this way and liberal politics in this way. Prior to that, it had been considered really a European phenomenon, a European cluster of concepts. So it became Americanized in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, the second decade of the 20th century, and it was this new liberalism, this more interventionist liberalism that the progressives adopted. Woodrow Wilson was one such liberal. You can really see him, President Wilson, describing himself as the progressive around 1912, and then starting to call himself a liberal in 1917. And in other parts of the world, this move didn't really happen. Even in France, if you wanted to speak about an interventionist kind of liberalism, you had to put another word in front of it, like reforming liberalism or social liberalism or liberal socialism. By the way, liberals did not think there was such a conflict or antagonism between socialism and liberalism in those days. It didn't necessarily mean government control. It meant more concern for the poor. Private property was fine. You just wanted to regulate markets and so on and so forth. So that's really how it happened. The split happened in the end of the 19th century, I would say.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and other socialist regimes. Some people thought that this was the beginning of the end of history, that liberal democracy and free markets would prevail throughout the world. However, over the past few years, we've seen a number of books, a number of arguments indicating that liberalism has failed and that we have to rethink what we're going to do, and that we have to have a more socially oriented political system. What do you make of this discussion?
I think it's interesting, and here again, history can lend some light on our current problems. This crisis of liberal democracy that we really see around the world today. I mean, look, even in America, we had Trump. The fact that he was not reelected is a good thing for liberal democracy. But let's remember that 70 million Americans voted for him. So even in America, we have this problem of rising populism and an attack basically on everything liberal democracy stands for. History can show us that this is nothing new, really. Liberalism has from the beginning been up against formidable odds and very powerful enemies who in fact appealed to the people over representative government. Dictators and demagogues, let's look at Napoleon, for example. And liberalism was very much actually conceived as a way in reaction to these dictators growing who used democracy really in order to increase their own power. They would appeal to the public's worst instincts, use propaganda, foreign wars, interventionism, talk about enemies, and so on and so forth in order really to enhance their own power and subvert liberal democracy. So today we have this terrible problem, and I'm afraid I, as a historian, first of all, a little uncomfortable with offering solutions, but I do think that there's no quick fix to this problem. I think education is a hugely important thing. The teaching of history, of civic values. In America, at least, humanities are really not as much appreciated as they should be. There's a lot of focus on vocational training of students, less on the liberal arts education, which liberals throughout history have thought so important to teach the young how liberals have fought. It's been a fighting faith that they have been imprisoned, they have been killed, they have been spied on, they have been censored in the history. So the problems we are facing are big, but we need a concerted effort. And it has to be a global effort. One of the things my book shows, I think I mentioned it previously, is that this is not just an Anglo-American tradition. Many countries have contributed to it in very important ways, and therefore there has to be some kind of global approach or discussion and to help one another. We cannot rely on the United States to solve this problem.
Well, I do want to thank you, Helena Rosenblatt, for speaking with us about liberalism. I think it's a little clearer, and I do get the impression, however, that we've never had it very clear what is a liberal or liberalism, and that we continue to have the same doubts that we had many decades or maybe centuries ago. Thank you. Es la profesora Helena Rosenblatt. Ella es autora de un libro que se llama La historia olvidada del liberalismo. Es un libro publicado en español por Editorial Planeta. Y yo quiero agradecerle a usted también que hace posible este programa, el que nos haya prestado atención. Pero no se le olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.